Can you hear me okay? I've got a pretty loud voice. Can you hear me at the back?
Yeah.
Good. So thanks for that splendid introduction. I'd like to thank Professor Jan for inviting us here as well. So what I'm going to do is, I understand that you're in the middle of a course, or you've been doing stuff on contingency and accidents in music, and perhaps electronic music. The book I've written about is about a piece of technology, the Moog electronic music synthesizer. Now there's one name in synthesizer you may have heard of. You may have heard of this name, M-O-O-G. Now I thought for many years, you can tell from my accent, that I'm not a local. I come from Britain, and in Britain we always used to call it Moog. And I thought it was a made-up name, Moog, for the sort of sound it makes. But it turns out there really is a Dr. Moog, or was. He died in 2005. He was the pioneer of electronic music synthesis, and he worked at Cornell University, where he got his PhD in engineering physics in 1965. And he invented, basically, the first commercial electronic music synthesizer in the period 1964 to 1970. And we have some Moog gear. By the way, he was annoyed by people pronouncing it Moog. He wanted them to pronounce it the right way. Very, very nice guy. He had on his office desk, he had a little sign. It always said, Moog rhymes with rogue, not Moog rhymes with you. He was quite sensitive about the way it was pronounced. And he had this factory where these synthesizers were produced in a place called Trumansburg. Anyone ever heard of Trumansburg? A few of you. It's just amazing. This place is in the middle of nowhere. Tiny little place, 12 miles north of Ithaca on Lake Cayuga. And in a furniture store, as you go through Trumansburg on the right, that's where Robert Moog had his factory. He was producing this legendary synthesizer that was bought by bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Just imagine that, it's like I've interviewed upstate workers who were in his factory, and they were selling synthesizers to these classic groups. Pretty amazing back then. And there's a picture from inside the factory. The thing he's probably most well known for is this synthesizer here, which we're going to be playing electric golem. That's called a mini Moog. And there is the Bob Moog, died in 2005. And the way to think about, basically work in the sociology of technology, history of technology. The way I think about musical instruments is to think of them as pieces of technology. So all the ideas you have, history and sociology of technology, you can apply to musical instruments. That's the approach I'm taking. If you think about it, pianos are kind of like machines. They're mass-produced. Synthesizers are like that. They're pieces of the technology, essentially. And that Bob Moog was kind enough to write a foreword to my book. And he talks about they're basically some of the most specialized technologies we humans have developed. Contingency or accident. There's contingency in terms of place, collaborations, Moog's collaborations, the place where the synthesizer developed, the design of the synthesizer, the sort of interface that's used. By that we mean how you interact with a musical instrument. So a violinist, will be playing with a bow, a keyboardist with a keyboard, a guitarist plucking strings. That's the interface. Users, the people who use this equipment, there's contingency there. The wider culture is a very important part of this story. And let me just jump to that immediately, because this is one of the big things about this story. What was happening, I'm going to ask you here, what was happening in the wider culture between the period 1964 to 1970? What's that period famous for? Think of the wider culture. Psychedelia, the psychedelic movement, psychedelic drugs. I know you're not supposed to talk about drugs, don't do drugs. But that was an important, these musicians, I think, did do drugs. They never inhaled, of course. The psychedelic music culture was a really important part of what happened in that period. And each new instrument that is developed needs a sort of music. Think of the music, although there's electric guitar with Jimi Hendrix, the psychedelic culture and the music, say, of the Beatles at the time was very influenced by psychedelia. And this Moog synthesizer was a wonderful instrument for playing in psychedelic type music, because the psychedelic music movement was after strange washes of sound, strange instruments. Remember, George Harrison used to play the sitar, unusual timbres that had that sort of spacey effect. Okay, so the sort of music as well as part of this wider culture is important. There's Trumansburg, a picture from 1970. I don't know if we can get rid of that little strange thing in the middle of the computer. Scott, is that possible to get rid of that? I don't know what it says there, that little blue. It shouldn't really be there, that thing, I don't know. You can maybe get rid of it, or move it somewhere.
Oh, crap. Fix it. Fix it.
Okay, thank you, got rid of it. Perfect. Good, thank you. Excellent work. So there you go, this is a picture of 970, that's the furniture store there. There's no plaque or anything in Trumansburg commemorating this astounding invention. There should be more. Here's a contingency. Moog is an engineer. In studying lots of these instruments from the electrical era of development of musical instruments, you usually find you need an engineer, electrical engineer, getting together with a musician. And Bob Moog, here's one of the first chance encounters. He met this guy, Herb Deutsch, an experimental composer in 1963. And they were in a loft in New York City, part of what the happening scene. They had things actually called happenings back then in New York City. And he had his mind blown, and he thought, wow, I think we have a new sort of musical instrument. Before then, people used to use big, off-the-shelf oscillators. His genius, Bob Moog, was to make this whole thing, electronic music, the source of it, much more compact. There's a picture of what the electronic music synthesizer, Moog's modular synthesizer, looked like back then. That is not Bob Moog, by the way. This picture was on the front of our book and got a lot of problems, caused a lot of problems for us, because Bob Moog thought it should be him. And worse, and people wouldn't think it was him. Because this guy's kind of bald and a bit ugly. It's a really classic picture from that. That's a guy called Mort Garson, produced the first synthesized album on the West Coast, called Zodiac Cosmic Sounds, which you can buy on eBay. Vinyl album. It says on the back, must be played in the dark. Incredible album. So, it looks like a big old analog telephone exchange. These wires are what control the sound, these patch wires. We have sources of sound. You can patch them endlessly. Now, the contingency, in terms of design here, is that you'll see there's a keyboard there. Bob Moog happened to have in his warehouse an old organ keyboard, which he hooked up to the synthesizer. Now, it's not obvious. You've got a new source of sound, electronic sound. You're going to control this with anything so conventional as a keyboard that comes over from the harpsichord and piano. Because he had this keyboard in his warehouse, that's the thing he hooked up to it. And the keyboard becomes, in fact, the dominant design. There's a guy on the West Coast we'll get to, working in Haight-Ashbury, a guy called Don Buchler, who rejected the use of keyboards. Old rockers. I did this study, by the way, going around interviewing engineers and musicians from the 60s. I kept thinking Cornell was going to pull the plug on this project. I cannot believe I was doing legitimate research, interviewing rock stars from the 60s. What a project, you ever lucky enough. And I interviewed the synthesizer player at the Grateful Dead, Keith Emerson of a huge band called Emerson, Lake and Palmer back then, Rick Wakeman of a band called Yes. I didn't actually get to interview the Beatles, unfortunately. They all played the synthesizer, the Beatles. That guy there is a guy called Don Preston, who Jim and I have actually played with, plays with Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. A lot of these guys are getting really old now. There's a link between this guy. Have we got time for this? Yeah, I'll just ask this question. There's a link between this guy and one of the most popular guitar riffs of all time, which is on Guitar Hero 1, Smoke on the Water, dun, 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 by Deep Purple. Anyone played that song? Anyone know it? Come on, you've got to know that song. It's a classic. And why is it Smoke on the Water? It's about the Deep Purple were over a lake in Switzerland, and Frank Zappa's band was playing in a casino, and the casino burnt down. And Don Preston told us it burnt down because some crazy Swiss set fire with a flare to the casino when he hit his Moog synthesizer to play a riff. And it's difficult to imagine that the Swiss would be crazy. My wife is Swiss, so I can talk about them. But this Swiss guy, you think him so sort of calm and methodical, went crazy and set fire to the place. And that's the whole song, Smoke of the Water. So this guy playing that solo is the link to that song. Another contingency. Everything's full of accidents and contingencies in history. What did this synthesizer sound like? Moog's first, he was in a basement in Trumansburg. I love quotes from Bob. Engineer tells you what it was like. The door was open, didn't have air conditioning, anything like that. It was late spring and people would walk by, they'd get something, they'd stand there, they'd listen, they'd shake their heads, They'd listen again. What is this weird shit coming up, basically? And you have to remember, now we are saturated with electronic sounds. All your cell phones have synthesizers in them. Most film music is used as synthesizers. Most TV shows have Moog synthesizer music. Back then, unless you'd heard the music of a composer like Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, this German composer, you would not have been exposed. It was seen as a very weird thing. And so part of the problem in my project, writing about this new soundscape that comes of electronic music, how do you describe it? What words do you use to describe this soundscape? So for Bob Moog, it's weird shit. Here's one of the few female, I've got a whole chapter in our book on women synthesizer players. There were a few players. Her name is Susan Charney, and she's playing this, as I said, this contingency in design. She's playing the West Coast synth, which rejects this guy Don Buckler. So we've got this new source of sound. Let's not have standard keyboards. We have these weird plates that play different voltages. He was interested in sweeps of sound, a whole different genre of sound. You press these plates here that make different voltages which would control the synthesizer. But keyboards dominate everything. Why were there keyboards? There's Bob Moog at the front there, again. I asked Bob about this. He said the keyboards were always there. Whenever someone wanted to take a picture, for some reason or other, it looks good if you're playing a keyboard. People understand that then you're making music. You know about it, you could be tuning in Russia. You've got to remember, these huge machines, they don't obviously look like music machines at all. So the keyboard is iconic. Most players can do a little bit of keyboard. They've been trained. It's monophonic, you know, at the time. So the keyboard was really important in the history of this instrument. And the fact that Moog, remember, just happened to have one in his warehouse and hook up to it, that led to this being basically the part of the synthesizer as being a keyboard part. We call it a path dependence over time. When you go in stores today to buy your Korg, your Yamaha Roland synthesizers, your Casios that you're hidden away in your studies and bedrooms, they're keyboard synthesizers. And that's because of this legacy of Moog. He also had a standard. We know in the history of technology, he standardized around keyboards, around a volt per octave. Music doesn't have to be about octaves, the 12 tones of the octave. It doesn't have to be that. The book rejected that vision at all. And this is how a piece of culture, music's about octaves, gets embedded into a piece of technology. I said users were important. People who develop new technologies learn from their customers, the people who use the thing, and Moog was very skilled at this. When he had a synthesizer ready in Trumansburg, this seems amazing. His main customers were in New York City. He'd take it down on the Greyhound bus, big cardboard boxes, a huge synthesizer, take it down on the Greyhound bus to his main customers in New York City. This is around the period 1965 to 68. And he'd learn, he'd watch how they installed it in their studio, he'd learn from them. He had his own studio in Trumansburg and bring musicians into his studio. And he also had a magazine he started, Electronic Music Review. It's a precursor to Keyboard magazine, which is a hobbyist magazine produced in his own studio. It wasn't he had the Harvard Business School plan to learn from users. This is how he puts it. All the people I did business with have remained collaborators and friends and customers. They've been very valuable personal friendships and guidance in refining synthesizer components. So here you see that the contingency of who you meet, your customers, are actually helping to shape this invention. So that's another important part of the story. They didn't know who was going to use this synthesizer. It was very expensive. The Moog, that big thing, price of a small house back then. You needed a very expensive tape recorder as well to work with it. It was hard to use live. You'd have to have tape recorders. So individual wealthy composers, academic departments could buy it. But an unexpected use was it. One Moog's second customer started to use it to make advertisements for little bits of sound to sell products like Coke or a coffee percolating ad or beer advertisements. And later, it's used in Star Wars as the first movie to use all synthesizers to produce the sound effects. So it's going to have a big use in Hollywood as well. That's Moog's second customer, Ericsson. They made his famous coffee percolating advert back then. Custom-built Moog. Then, here's another important contingency. I asked my daughter, who's a sophomore at Penn, whether she'd seen this movie. She hadn't, so I'm guessing that your generation, you may not have seen this movie. This was a classic 60s movie. Check it out, stream it, whatever you do these days. I was going to say, go and buy it on VHS, but no, stream it. Monterey Pops. Jimi Hendrix was there, burning his guitar. The Who were there, smashing their guitars. This is a really key point where the psychedelic music comes together with the synthesizer. Because at Monterey Pop, in this fairground in California, Bob Moog had set up a little tent with synthesizers, sounds, a synthesizer there, and headphones. And these musicians, I have to tell you, everyone we've interviewed there was stoned out of their minds. They put on these headphones, and they heard the sound of the Moog synthesizer. People like Jim Morrison from The Doors. Man, this is cool. Got to have one of these on our album. So these bands had them on their album. The Doors, the Byrds, the Beatles, Notorious Bird Brothers from the Byrds. Jim Morrison uses it on that. Ever listen to Strange Days, that album? You hear Morrison's voice goes through the Moog filter. Strange Days. Sometimes I play this music. I haven't got time for that. one of the most famous pieces of music that's saturated with Moog synthesizer is George Harrison's Here Comes the Sun. I said all the Beatles could play the synthesizer. George had his own synthesizer. They're the Beatles playing the synthesizer. But this is on their album Abbey Road. One of my favourite, Jim's favourite synthesizer bands, we played one of these guys, Knock and Sissel, Tonto's Expanding Headband. Full-on psychedelia. All made with a Moog synthesizer. They made an incredible album, Zero Time, and Stevie Wonder heard that album, and he wanted Moog sounds on his own records, and that was his breakthrough albums, Music of My Mind and so on, for the early 1970s, was Stevie Wonder playing with these two hippies, basically, Malcolm Cecil and Bob Markell from Tonto's Expanding Headband, playing all the Moog for Stevie. He was touring in front of the Rolling Stones, and that introduced the synthesizer to a huge new audience. Switched on Bach. Those of you that are old enough, look back in your record, someone's laughing there, look back in your record collection, and this is an album you may find. Look for your parents' record collections. You may find this is Bach done on the synthesizer. Absolutely amazing. And this made the synthesizer famous. This is still one of the best-selling classical albums of all time, all done on the Moog synthesizer, switched on Bach. It was a huge hit, and the record industry, being the way it is, immediately sent people to Trumansburg to buy synthesizers, and every genre of music then became switched on. You can buy these albums on eBay, switched on Nashville, switched on Bacharach, more switched on Bacharach. And there's 4 Moog Christmas albums, real collector's piece. Switched on Santa. The name Switched On was pretty good because you're switching on the synthesizer, and back then, if you were a cool person, don't have the word cool, back then it was switched on. You just switched on, you're hit. That's what his factory looked like, Moog up in Trumansburg. He employed a lot of women who were quilters. So place really matters in this story. Here's the contingency. Booker's on the West Coast, he's friends with the Grateful Dead. He consumes lots of LSD. I had this slide up and Don Booker was in the audience. He actually laughed at it. He absolutely agrees. This is important. Moog lives in unhip Trumansburg. He's a bystander to the 60s, remains as a 50s engineer with his pen protector. He attends pot parties, that's cannabis parties, but he never inhales. He hired a sales rep in LA to deal with the hippies, as he called them, up on the West Coast, who were buying his synthesizer, people like Jim Morrison and so on. And he had very Bob once over a glass of wine. I think he wanted his synthesizer to be used more in classical music, as Wendy Carlos had. He liked the customers. Eventually, it became a whole huge cult hero for many young rockers. But I think in his dreams, he'd hoped it was going to become a more serious instrument to be used in classical. It's actually used a lot more in dance music, electronics, and pop and rock. Every genre uses it. It hasn't revolutionized. And that's the synthesizer that Bob Moog won a Grammy for in 2001, along with Steve Jobs. It's that important. Steve Jobs got it for the Macintosh, Moog got it for the Mini Moog synthesizer. Transformed the music industry, this synthesizer. It's like the big modular thing, but now it's a keyboard synthesizer. And there's some of the performers in his finery. Keith Emerson from the band ELP. If you ever check out a song called Lucky Man by ELP, Keith Emerson does the solo at the end. It's the definitive kind of rock solo. Some of you will remember that. Pink Floyd was a British synthesizer company. I've interviewed the guys from that called the Electronic Music Studio. And Pink Floyd used it for Dark Side of the Moon. They had access to this local synthesizer. And that's often famous albums are defined by the sort of sound they produce. And that album is saturated with the VCS-free electronic sounds. Pink Floyd made a huge hit from it, of course. So I'm going to end there. We're going to play in about 10 minutes, but I want to give time for questions or discussion about what I presented in terms of the electronic music synthesizer. Just to summarize, all inventions, contingency or accident, play a role. Nothing is predetermined about the technology we have. Strange sorts of things happen. Just look at your computers, and you'll see that the keyboard on it is QWERTY. Those are the first letters of your keyboard. This is a keyboard that comes over from the typewriter. It was originally developed to slow down typists, because those typists that hammered like that, and the keys would hammer together, they didn't want to type too fast, so it jammed. So you haven't got the best, most efficient technology on our keyboard. But this almost accident that the typewriter came first determines what we have today. So when you start looking back in the history of technology, you find many, many accidents, branching paths where it could go one way or the other. And we end up today with keyboard synthesizers, but it didn't have to be that way. You could have had Buchler's vision, could have trumped, there'd been a series of accidents the other way, and we'd have had a very different synthesizer. It's nice to sort of think about our culture in this term. these terms, the role of contingency and accident, so how we end up being where we are. Okay, any questions? Discussion? Happy to answer any questions about the history of the synthesizer. Do you usually have discussion, Jan, in class? Is that?
You do, yeah.
Yeah, come on. Come on, Elmira, show me your questions. I know you're all waiting for the concert.
So,
yeah.
Couldn't you argue the opposite, that the familiarity of the technology sort of determines what you're going to prevail? You know, the keyboard example and the typewriter example, because we're familiar with this and translates using technology. I think this is something I know.
Yeah, very good question. Excellent question, excellent point. Because I was asked to lecture about contingency. I've overemphasized contingency in this lecture. There are things, as you point out, that are familiar, and this is true of the history of the synthesizer, and this is true of musical instruments in general, that you need familiar interfaces. People don't like new ways of interacting with pieces of technology. If you think about the history of the computer, one of the big innovations has been the mouse. But we still, as I said, we have the QWERTY keyboard. We have the mouse we're interacting with. There's not much else, other ways of interacting with our computers. And the mouse is very interesting, the story of Douglas Engelbart and the history of the mouse, because it starts off as, he had 5 keys on it originally. He was thinking of it in terms of a musical type interface originally. So we are very conservative as humans in what we accept. And that's one of the interesting things about the history of electronic music instruments and musical instruments in general. Why we have so few new instruments, despite inventors coming up with many, many ideas. If you go back to the history of instruments, you find the last century, the synthesizer is one of the few new classes of instruments. You can go in a music store and buy a synthesizer. You've got the electric guitar, you've got electrical organs, like the Hammond organ. Hammond was another Cornell student. You've got to go back for another major instrument to 1840, an Adolph sax and the saxophone. And that instrument only really takes off in the 1930s with jazz. So we are, you're right, we're kind of, it's the familiarity of things as well. So you have contingency on one side and accident, but also familiarity is another important component in the history of technology. Because we as humans are kind of we seem to be conservative. You know, if you, just imagine using your computer and someone comes up with a new way. Touch screens, of course, is the new way of interacting. I guess you'd say with the iPad and touch screens, that's another new way of your phones, another new way of interacting. So that's a significant invention, actually, to be able to touch. That's probably, there aren't that many, though, if you think about it. I mean, we could have, you could imagine there could be devices that could be fixed to your eyes, you just blink your eyes. Stephen Hawking says one of these. I mean, you can imagine this could become popular. You could have a little device, you just flick your eye to control it. There could be all sorts of fascinating ways of interacting. They haven't taken off. Question there, yeah.
You obviously are really interested in it. What got you so interested in learning about the synthesizer?
Yeah. You notice my passion for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, when I was a kid, I used to listen to radio, shortwave radio on headphones. And I built shortwave radios. And if you, back then, this is in Britain, rural Britain, 1960, you were tuning in radio, you'd hear the sound of jamming, you'd hear Morse code, you'd hear beeps and things, and that was electronic music, sort of ambient electronic music. And I think that's, I did, in my bedroom, did that so often, that I got a love for that sort of weird stuff. And then when I went to university in the early 1970s in London, they had an electronic music society. And I heard the sound of my first synthesizer, which is that British one, the Pink Floyd music. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. There's a whole instrument that makes this weird noise that I'm hearing on my shortwave. I'm going to get into that. And sure enough, I did. And I actually had a career. This is why it's nice that I'm playing electric golem. I had a short career as an electronic musician in London. We got to support one band, famous band called Hawkman. It was the furthest I got in my career. We were the opening act, they were the last act. And I realized that a life in music was really tough. A lot of the musicians I interviewed, it's a hard life being a gigging musician. You've got to schlep a lot of gear around, they don't have health insurance, and a few of them make it colossally famous, but most of them don't. And I had another career. It learned its head. It was much more attractive, academia. Being a professor, it's a safer career, safer salary. And recently I've been able to combine my passion for electronic music, through meeting Jim. Jim was originally not someone I was studying, actually, as a musician. And then I changed from studying to playing with him. He let me play with him. That's how the electric golem got going. So that's where my passion comes from. And you never stop being a musician. I think if you're a musician, you're always a musician. But sometimes, you know, you have to sort of just put it a little bit to the side and do something else. But then the chance comes, you can get it out again, your passion. Let everyone experience it and share it. They're kind enough to experience. So thanks. That's a good question back, yeah.
What process does sound go through to be synthesized?
Sorry, I missed the question?
What process does sound have to go through to be synthesized?
What process does sound have to go through to be synthesized?
Go through the process.
Yeah, well, these synthesizers produce their own sound. But that's a good question because that's another part of the sort of story here, how sound gets made. These synthesizers produce their own sound. They produce it from something called oscillators and these analog synthesizers. And they go through things, this is called subtractive synthesis. You have a complicated waveform, you put it through things like filters and make it a bit simpler and voltage-controlled amplifiers. But back then, it was almost impossible to emulate the sound of an orchestral or acoustic instrument. It was really hard to do it back then. And that slowly became more possible in the history of synthesis. By the time you get to the 1980s in digital polyphonic keyboards like the Yamaha DX7 synthesizer, you can start to produce very good emulation of acoustic instruments. And they're generated by different sorts of techniques. Today it's done digitally. But back then it was things called oscillators. And all musical instruments, if you think about it, something vibrating. It's just an electrical oscillator, essentially, is the guts of these things. You'll hear it when I play. It's sort of whiny noise. That's the guts of this. I think we've got time. Any got one last question or comment? Otherwise we'll start. Oh yeah, there. We'll segue into doing the performance. Good question. Any connection between the synthesizer and the auto-tune? I don't think... I've got a grad student at Cornell who's been starting to write and research auto-tunes. No one's actually done very much academic work on the history of auto-tune yet. It's such a new technology, although Scheer had that hit with it, I think, at least 10 years ago. But it's a really new technology. The history comes from the oil industry. The guy who invents auto-tune has got a way of looking for oil reserves for sending audio signals. So there's no, as far as I can tell, direct link. He's coming from a different place. But it's a great example, by the way, of contingency auto-tune, because the original idea of auto-tune, as you probably all know, is for use in the studio for correcting out-of-pitch notes. So when you have a singer who's not very good, like a lot of singers aren't too great, you can just put auto-tune and you can correct them. Then someone, of course, discovered, hey, it's got this really cool sound that sounds a bit like a vocoder. And we crank everything up. And then you get all this, hip-hop, rap songs with auto-tune that we're saturated with. There's one channel in Ithaca where every song on the radio is on auto-tune. It's my daughter's favorite. I can't stand it. Auto-tune gets really annoying after a while. So there's a connection there. It's got a really dominant sound. And many of these synthesizers have a kind of dominant sound. It sounds cool to start, but after a while it starts to get a bit annoying. There's a connection there. We hope we're not going to be annoying today. So maybe, we'll take a little, we're going to have just to tune up the instruments maybe for a minute or two, just to check everything. Just talk amongst yourselves for a couple of minutes, and then we'll launch into the concert. Thank you. Do you like our sign? It was made in Shanghai by a friend of mine. Incredibly powerful LEDs.
last weekend we played at Cornell Cinema we did the sound score for a silent film from 1902 called A Trip to the Moon. And it was a lot of fun to do, but that film was only about 11 or 12 minutes long. We're going to extend that piece today, so it'll be about 25 to 30 minutes long with a little more improvisation thrown in to extend it. And usually when we do a performance like this, we try to come up with some flip title of the piece we're doing. And maybe it comes to us on the drive to the venue. And so since the film was called A Trip to the Moon, this piece today is called A Trip to Elmira. It's actually the first time either of us have been in Elmira, and we love it so far. So
We're looking forward to seeing the grave of Mark Twain, which I've never seen either.
and this performance will also be analog, Trevor's equipment, versus digital. I'll be using an iPod, iPad, and a Nintendo DSi.
This synth I'm playing here I built in 1973 in London, and it's a kind of insane synth. Sometimes we get smoke out of it, so if it works, it'll be a miracle. I love it, but it's got a unique sound.
The video today will be provided by one of your professors, Jan Cather. We want to thank her for inviting us to perform. And when we're done playing, if anyone is interested in seeing this equipment up close, Trevor has some wonderful vintage equipment. And I think there's some really cool fun stuff that you all probably own yourselves. When we're done performing, please feel free to come up. We'll do a little workshop if you want to see what we're using, if you want to see the apps I'm using. Maybe you can tell me some new apps. This is how I find out new stuff. So, or if you have an app to make music with and you think you can join us, just join in. All right, are you ready? A Trip to Elmira.
Thank you.